I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, after a 17-year-old girl was killed and 9 others injured in an overnight Russian missile attack in Kharkiv Oblast, we return to the dire situation in Pokrovsk before asking, why is Putin targeting his own war cheerleaders in his latest clampdown? Then we look at the First World War medical condition being reported on the front lines in Ukraine, and hear from an American serving in the Ukrainian army.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 18th of November, 3 years and 269 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by the Telegraph's Associate Editor for Defence, Dominic Nicholls, our foreign reporter, Verity Bowman, and Tank Unit Commander and Chemical Weapons Expert, Hamish to Bretton-Gordon. First, though, over to Dom for the latest on the battlefront.
Well, thanks, Francis. Hello, everyone. Hello, Verity. Great to see you again. Let's go straight into the Donbass and Pokrovsk. It looks like Russia's still trying to encircle the town, seemingly on foot rather than vehicles. We spoke at length yesterday about why they seem to be deprioritising the use of vehicles in Pokrovsk. So do have a listen back just the first few minutes. But yeah, slow progress there, albeit, and I always caveat with this, accurate news, very, very difficult to come by in a war situation, especially in something like Pokrovsk. Now then, elsewhere, a 17-year-old girl was killed and 9 others injured in an overnight Russian missile attack on the city of Berestyn in Kharkiv Oblast this morning. Although it's in Kharkiv Oblast, it's closer to Poltava city than Kharkiv, Poltava city being about 50 km northwest of this strike. This comes after that Russian missile strike on the town of Balaklia, a little further to the northeast yesterday, that killed 3 people, wounded 15. There does seem to be an uptick in the number of attacks across Kharkiv Oblast in the last week or so. Now, they were part of a continuation of aerial attacks in the last 24 hours that saw Russia fire 4 ballistic missiles and 114 long-range drones. Ukraine's Air Force brought down 101 drones, but none of the missiles. There's possibly less artillery being fired by Russia in the eastern Donbass as Russian units are rotating there, I've been told this morning. However, generally, rail infrastructure seems to be a priority target for Russia, with rail lines and stations in Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast hit yesterday. Now, Ukraine's ground forces yesterday published photos of the destruction in Konstantinivka in the Donbass, that's near Chasiv Yar, about 50 km northeast of Pokrovsk. A report accompanying the photos in a post on Facebook said there were still about 4,800 civilians left in the city, and local authorities are still trying to evacuate people where possible. However, the ground forces said numerous burned cars on the outskirts of the city and on all major roads indicate how dangerous and difficult such evacuation operations are. In a statement, they said staying civilian, as in civilians remaining in the city, is more dangerous. The enemy is constantly dropping controlled aerial bombs on residential quarters with huge charges and turning them into the cells of hell on earth. Now then, in Russian-occupied Ukraine, Russian Telegram channels have published images of an alleged strike by Ukraine on the Russian-controlled Zhuivska thermal power plant in Jerez in occupied Donetsk Oblast. Images online show powerful searchlights, about 3 or 4 searchlights sweeping the sky, clearly looking for something. There's outgoing fire as well, and then a very large, or at least one very large blast visible. Now, outside the country, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has said that the sabotage on Polish railways yesterday was carried out by 2 Ukrainian citizens who had arrived from Belarus. Donald Tusk said the identified individuals are 2 citizens of Ukraine who have been cooperating and acting in the interests of Russian special services for a considerable time. He said although they knew who they were, personal data, etc., that's all being handed over to the investigators, he's not going to make that public. Now, this comes after the Polish Defence Minister, Władysław Kosiniak-Hamish, said earlier today that the sabotage yesterday was most likely carried out by Russian special services. That seems to have been updated by Donald Tusk in the last few minutes. Mr. Kosiniak-Hamish said, only when the criminals are caught will we have absolute certainty, but analysing all the events taking place in Poland and Europe, all the trails lead east to Russia. This is part of the hybrid war they are waging against NATO, against Europe, against us, to sow unrest, to sow fear. We are to be cautious but not afraid, humble but strong. Everything is designed to destroy community, destroy alliances and sow uncertainty. I mean, the last bit still stands. I think the first part of his comments there have been overtaken by events. Donald Tusk now saying that, yes, they were acting on behalf of the Russian special services. Now, the head of the Polish Armed Forces, he said earlier yesterday that Russia is preparing for war with Poland. He was speaking on Polski Radio, Poland's public broadcast radio service. This is Chief of the General Staff, General Władysław Kukula. He said Russia has begun the period of preparing for war. They're building an environment here intended to create conditions favourable for potential aggression on Polish territory. Now, he said that before yesterday's announcement about the blast on that Warsaw to Lublin line. Andrei Sybiha, Ukraine's foreign minister, had said that was a Russian hybrid attack designed to test responses. And interestingly, talking about those hybrid attacks, General Kukula said before the rail blast, remember, he said, if anyone has been to war, they know that what we are experiencing today is not an actual war. It is, in fact, a pre-war situation, or what we refer to as hybrid warfare. Now then, I don't think we want to overdo this, because he did also say, to be honest, we are always in a pre-war period, so sort of pulls the rug out from under his argument. He says even the Cold War was such a period. It is a matter of managing this pre-war time, building an effective deterrence policy, largely based on our defensive capabilities, but also on the attitude of citizens. I think we should interpret that as him saying, do not expect an imminent invasion of Poland. But he was a little bit, I said, a little bit sort of back and forth as his messaging then. Now, last one for me, Francis. Bellingcat, the open source intelligence research organisation, says satellite imagery shows that construction activity has accelerated at Russia's new Black Sea naval base in Okhotniki in Georgia. It accelerated since early 2024. You'll remember in October 23, the president of Abkhazia, that's the Russian-backed separatist region of Georgia, announced that a new Russian Navy base would be built to serve as a, quote, permanent place of deployment for parts of Russia's Black Sea fleet. Okhotniki is a small harbour basically serving a coal terminal and the FSB, Russian FSB Coast Guard division. This is as Ukraine have basically shoved the Black Sea fleet out of Crimea and largely out of Novorossiysk as well. Now, Bellingcat says that these plans were not confirmed. His plans to develop Okhotniki were not confirmed by Russia at the time, and there was little observable activity in the months after that announcement until now. It does seem that Russia's looking for a new safe haven for the Black Sea fleet. Hat tip, I should say, to John Hardy, Deputy Director of the Russia Programme at the Washington-based Foundation for Defence of Democracy. He points us towards that story. And that's us up to date, Francis.
Well, thanks, Dom. Yes, the sabotage in Poland is another of those what would once have been front page news everywhere and now no one bats an eyelid type stories. We've talked many times about Moscow's recruitment of foreign nationals in such attacks. They consider them dispensable. This time it appears to be Ukrainians, a helpful choice for political reasons too. Lest we forget, this follows the shooting down of those Russian drones which crossed into Polish territory a few weeks ago, the first time NATO collectively engaged Moscow directly. Given all of this, I think there can be no doubt the Kremlin is becoming yet more bellicose, both internationally and domestically. The Telegraph published a piece yesterday looking at how, once again, Putin is sharpening the axe for use against his own war cheerleaders, specifically men like Roman Alekhine, who ran the fervently pro-war Telegram channel and received military honours for fighting in Ukraine. In short, a poster boy for the Z bloggers. Now, he has been designated a foreign agent in response to what analysts believe is another clampdown on those who critique and criticise the way the war is being fought in Russia. To quote Keir Giles, senior Russia analyst at Chatham House, this is the kind of dissent that, if it were directed at the political system, would have earned reprisals long ago. The Z blogosphere was seen by some as a safety valve, a means by which critics could vent without actually challenging the overall state policy. That avenue has now been closed off. Now, for those of you who've been with us since the beginning, you might be forgiven for experiencing a bit of déjà vu. This has echoes of what ultimately happened to the Wagner Group, which of course was given more flexibility in terms of messaging and operational permissions and strategy. But when they went too far, they were purged, as inevitably happens in such regimes. If you missed it yesterday, our Europe editor James Crisp interviewed Vladimir Kara-Murza, the opposition activist sentenced to 25 years in a penal colony in Siberia for his criticism of the war. He was one of those whose release was negotiated in 2024 by the Americans and others. It's well worth a listen. He underscores that, and I quote, "Once this machinery of repression starts, it cannot stop. Look at the Soviet Union under Stalin. First they went after their political enemies, and then the system began to devour its own people." One could argue that's only going to increase the more internal pressure rises, not least economically. The initial impact of oil sanctions against Lukoil and Rosneft seems to be bigger than expected. Bloomberg reports that Russian Urals fell to just $36 now, with discounts widening to $24 as Chinese and Indian refiners are less eager to buy. So those American sanctions are significant, as sanctions expert Stephanie Baker predicted on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. But it bears repeating that other sanctions are still circumvented with relative ease. Yesterday, Kyiv's military intelligence published new data on foreign equipment Russia uses in weapon production, focusing on East Asian companies, including the Japanese Okuma Corporation and Korean Samsung Machine Engineering Company. The HUR said these companies are indirectly helping Moscow produce a unified module for gliding and guidance kit for glide bombs, as well as missiles and artillery ammunition. Now, in the past 24 hours, President Trump has said he is ready to sign new sanctions against Russia, finally giving the green light for the bipartisan Graham-Blumenthal bill to go through Congress, but only, crucially, if he retains final say over its implementation. So the cripplingly high secondary tariffs the bill would impose against countries purchasing Russian oil and gas could be voided or lowered at the White House's whim. For many, that effectively neuters the bill, though others say it would send a powerful signal. We'll, of course, continue to monitor it. Despite all of this, Moscow seems to have no desire to negotiate, or even to be seen to want to. Beleaguered at home, President Zelensky's just announced an attempt to revive the talks with Russia on how to end the war, once again in Turkey, though it's unclear whether this is at the behest of the United States, as Special Envoy Witkoff is going. For now, these contacts are taking place without Russian participation, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said. Now, there are risks for Moscow, of course, but clearly they feel their position is strong, and one can hardly blame them. The pressure on Zelensky continues, with Ukrainian Pravda reporting that key government officials, after the high-profile Nabu investigation we've been talking about for several days now, are advising Zelensky to dismiss Andriy Yermak, the head of his office. As we've discussed many times, Yermak is very unpopular within the government machine and beyond. There was seemingly a concerted effort within Washington to see him removed, given his unpopularity over there, and many blame the disastrous Oval Office encounter back in February on him failing to prepare the president. According to sources among the top leaders of Zelensky's Servant of the People party, it's easier to count people in the parliament who would not ask for Yermak's resignation now. But he is an incredibly powerful figure, and it's obvious Zelensky doesn't feel he can lose him. Whether that's the right decision or not, only history can judge. For now, key figures are coming out to support Zelensky publicly. Bogdanov, head of military intelligence, has just spoken publicly, saying that the anti-corruption bodies have done their job and the president has made the right decisions. He also said it's up to the court, that those guilty of corruption during wartime must be severely punished, and that the scandal could negatively affect international aid. He said Russia is already actively exploiting the story through bot networks and propaganda to discredit Ukraine in the eyes of partners. We must not give the enemy additional pretexts, he said. Now, while we're on the subject of Kyiv's finances, Bloomberg also confirms reports the EU is preparing 90 billion euros in grants for Ukraine if the plan to use frozen Russian assets fail. The European Commission has outlined 3 options: direct grants from member states, a joint EU loan, or using the assets as loan collateral. But again, we won't know until mid-December. The financial issue, though, pales in significance to the most pressing one facing the Ukrainians, the manpower crisis. As The Economist reports, a source in Ukrainian military intelligence suggests Russia has the resources to pin Ukraine back throughout 2026 using only voluntary recruitment, so without the need for a conscription drive. Apparently, this year's recruitment drive in Russia is on course to meet its target of 403,000 soldiers, only slightly down from 420,000 in 2024. Some regions will underfill the plan, others will overfill, the source says. This is incredibly serious, if true. As I discussed with Dr. Jack Watling of RUSI last Monday, the 10th, the recruitment metric in both countries is absolutely key for the next phase of the war, as is the perception of them. If Moscow needed to adopt another conscription drive, that would have extremely serious ramifications for them domestically. If they don't, given Kyiv's shortage, things could become far more severe than they already are over the coming months on the front lines. So a bleak picture indeed on the proverbial Eastern Front at the moment. But let's return to the Western Front now, in a different era, with foreign reporter at the Telegraph, Verity Bowman, who looks closely into battlefield conditions for us. Verity, welcome back. You're going to talk us through a medical issue being observed on the front lines in Ukraine, not seen since the First World War. Tell us about this.
Well, hi, thank you for having me today. It's great to be back. So Ukrainian medics are now documenting cases of gangrene, which is this rapidly progressing bacterial infection caused by Clostridium bacteria. As you just said right then, Francis, it's a condition widely associated with the trenches of the First World War. And really, it's long thought to have been all but eradicated in Europe. What's important to know is this isn't a mild infection. Basically, when deep wounds aren't treated quickly, the bacteria thrive in oxygen-starved tissue, and this produces toxins and gas bubbles underneath the skin. One especially chilling detail that has stuck with me even after writing this story is that in the infected area, if you touch it, you can hear a crackling sound underneath, and that is the gas trapped underneath the tissue. So I spoke to Alex about this. He's a volunteer medic in the Zaporizhzhia region. And he told me, to quote, that we are seeing injury complications that have never been seen by any living person in wartime. So the return of this gas gangrene is closely linked to delays in medical evacuation, which is a huge issue facing Ukraine at the moment. On the front lines, wounded soldiers are spending days, even weeks, in makeshift shelters and these underground stabilisation points that only have a few medical staff before they can be safely moved. So to quote Alex again, he said, "These types of delayed evacuation times have never been seen in the last few decades, probably since the Second World War, and maybe not even that. We're seeing pathology that we've never seen before." So the constant threat of Russian drones has really complicated evacuation. Without rapid treatment, gas gangrene can become very difficult to control. Treatment normally requires surgical removal of the infected tissue alongside a high dose of antibiotics, often intravenously. On the front lines, however, medics often lack the sterile facilities that they need. I spoke to Dr. Lindsay Edwards, who is a microbiologist at King's College London, and she explained to me that the condition is extremely life-threatening and that if left untreated, the mortality rate is close to 100%.
Well, thank you, Verity. This is a really shocking story, and of course we'll link to it in the show notes. I wonder if you could talk in a little bit more detail about the last time we saw gas gangrene, and perhaps a little bit more about why it's back now. You've talked about some of the conditions, but I think some people will be interested a little bit more about how it starts and how it grows to become as serious as it does.
Well, gas gangrene was one of the most feared infections during World War I. Back then, soldiers fought in trenches, which were often contaminated with soil and manure, which creates the perfect breeding ground for Clostridium spores. Without modern medicine, particularly antibiotics that were introduced in later wars, it became quite common on the battlefield. Now, the conditions in parts of Ukraine, like the prolonged evacuation, the high-risk wounds, limited medical infrastructure, and the fact that they are also often fighting in areas with soil and manure contaminated by the bacteria. It's eerily sort of recreating that century-old danger. So basically in Ukraine, the targeted use of antibiotics is often near impossible in the immediate period after an injury due to limited access to laboratories. Normally, you would screen microbes, you would culture them and use various techniques to determine if there is any drug resistance. You'd also test antibiotics to find out which would be most effective. But of course, all of this has gone out of the window in a field hospital in the middle of nowhere. So antimicrobial resistance is also a huge issue in Ukraine. We've reported on it quite a bit on the global health section of the Telegraph, so you can go there and learn more. Basically, when a bacteria, virus or other microbes evolve and stop responding to the drugs designed to kill them. And this makes infections harder and sometimes impossible to treat. This is something, again, that we're seeing a lot in Ukraine at the moment. The comeback of gas gangrene really underlines how medical and logistical challenges in war can turn survivable injuries into fatal infections. It also highlights a bit of a tragic paradox in that despite advances in modern medicine, the realities of war, like drone threats and frontline chaos, can resurrect diseases that were, nearly eliminated. And it is important to remember that, of course, this isn't the biggest killer in Ukraine at the moment. It hasn't completely overwhelmed it, but it's definitely something to keep an eye on. And I think for policymakers and military planners, all of this signals quite a dire need to strengthen frontline medical evacuation, improve the field hospital infrastructure, and simply make sure that medics have the resources they need to treat complex infections.
Well, thank you, Verity. A sobering story, and the piece goes into lots more detail about this for those who are interested. You mentioned medical evacuation there, and staying on the World War I theme, there's a haunting passage in the classic World War I account, Goodbye to All That, by British soldier Robert Graves, where he describes man after man being killed, going into no man's land, trying to rescue just one wounded comrade. It's one of the most striking sections of the book. And there's still an issue around that even today in the Ukraine context. We've read copious examples of similar stories. But your next one looks into innovative solutions to try and abate that. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so I think this story links very well to the other, as it really highlights the issues Ukraine is facing when it comes to medical evacuations. It's honestly a very chilling tale. Basically, for 33 days, a Ukrainian soldier was critically wounded and isolated behind enemy lines. He remained trapped. He was under constant threat. And something that has really stuck with me is for those 33 days, he had a tourniquet keeping him alive. You can't even imagine how horrific that would be to go through. His own side had already tried to recover him 6 times using ground robotic systems. But every time something went wrong, whether that be mines, drones, or destroyed vehicles. But now enters the hero of the story, a remotely operated ground robot, which is known as MAUL. MAUL. This isn't just any robot, it's a rugged off-road vehicle built for rescue. It has basically this armoured capsule, which works as a protective casket for carrying a wounded person. It runs on a combustion engine to give it more power and speed. And interestingly, the wheels are metal and airless, so they're designed to survive mine blasts. In this mission, it managed to go up to 70 kilometers per hour, according to its designers. The mission was codenamed GVER by the 1st Separate Medical Battalion, which carried out the operation. So to lay it out for you, the MAUL set off into hostile territory and it navigated through mines and dangerous terrain. Along the way, it struck an anti-personnel mine and one of its wheels were badly damaged. But it didn't stop there. These wheels are made out of metal. They can keep going. It pulled up to the wounded soldier. He climbed inside. You can see this on video footage that is at the top of the article I wrote. On its way back, after picking up the wounded soldier, a Russian drone dropped explosive on it. But the capsule protected the soldier inside. The whole mission was almost 6 hours long, exactly 5 hours and 58 minutes by the battalion's account. In total, it covered quite a staggering 64 kilometres and 37 kilometres of that were with a damaged wheel. When the robot made it back to Ukrainian-held territory, medics were ready and they stabilised the soldier immediately. They removed the tourniquet and the soldier is now in Kiev undergoing rehabilitation after sadly having an amputation.
So what broader lessons can we draw from this rescue? Is this something that we can expect to be quite common, or is this still very much a kind of one-off incident as the technology is being developed?
Well, I think it isn't really just a high-tech stunt. I think it's got some really deep strategic and moral significance. I think it's really showing how unmanned systems are becoming, essential for medical evacuation in modern warfare, especially under drone threat and minefields. The success of this mission shows that such systems could save so many more lives because it's hard for humans to risk those same routes repeatedly. I think it's also a symbol of innovation born of necessity. The MAWL wasn't outsourced from big defence contractors. It was built locally by people who know what the front line needed. Important in all of this is that President Zelensky praised the operation and said that Ukraine plans to scale up robotic rescue capabilities. So more ground robots, more drones, more modern systems that save lives. Ukraine at the moment is increasingly leaning on robotic technology, not just for rescue, but for supply lines, mine clearing, and even direct combat roles. These ground robots reduce the risk to human medics and soldiers, but at the same time allow life-saving missions to go ahead in places where they once couldn't.
Well, Verity, thank you so much for talking us through those two stories. And as I say, we will link to both in the show notes. Do feel free to stay for the final thoughts later on. But let's turn to Hamish now, who I'm sure has got some thoughts on both of these stories. Hamish, welcome back. I wanted to ask you, first of all, just talking about injuries there that we're seeing on the battlefield, and injuries we don't talk about as often are those that take place for soldiers in tanks. And you are, of course, a former tankie and proud to be so. What kind of injuries have we seen in Ukraine inside tanks, and how might they be different or the same as those that you experienced in your time in the British Army?
Good afternoon, everybody. Very good to be back on. And just to pick up on a couple of things that Verity said, in the British military, we have the golden hour rule where, you've got to get to surgery within that first hour. Now, Ukraine has, made that so much more difficult, and some solutions they've got are quite remarkable. A world-famous doctor, Dr. David Nott, who I used to run with in Syria, has actually been in Ukraine. He's a surgeon, a trauma surgeon, trying to teach medics at the very front line to do basic sort of life-saving surgery to try and get around that issue. But it's a huge problem. And when we look at tanks, I mean, the great fear for all tank crews is firstly fire. Then what we call spall, which is where basically a bit of shrapnel wings around the turret, because once something hits the turret, bits fall off, as it were, and wing round, or actually blast injuries. Interesting enough, there's sort of two issues here. The older Russian Soviet tanks, which have fairly standard basic steel armor or reactive armor, explosive armor, are very different to the sort of Leopards and the Challenger 2s, which have what we call ceramic or laminated armor, which means with the Western tanks, you don't get so many of these spall shrapnel injuries inside the tank because the armor prevents that happening. But any Ukrainian or Russian in a sort of really a T-72 and older, which is most of the tanks on the front line at the moment, would probably suffer from these horrendous sort of shrapnel injuries. We also seen an awful lot of fires and explosions in the tanks, with FPV drones and others actually getting explosive through turrets or weak areas, and then creating the ammunition to what we call cook-off. Again, on modern Western tanks, ammunition is stored in what we call armoured charge bins, which means that it can't explode or much more difficult to. But again, in the Soviet tanks, that happens. So burn injuries are very widespread in tank warfare, as long as shrapnel. But the same requirement for immediate evacuation, immediate first aid to try and save the lives of those. The final bit on this one, Francis, again, we have seen Leopards and Challengers hit, but generally it's what we call an M kill, a mobility kill. And it would appear that generally the crews survive. They might be injured, but we're seeing mostly with the sort of Russian T-72 tanks and older, if they are hit, they sort of stay hit, a K kill, which means they're finished, and the crews inside are generally in a much worse position.
Well, thanks for talking us through that, Hamish. Really interesting. I don't think that's a subject we've talked about on the podcast before, so much appreciated. Now, you've written for The Telegraph your reflections on the Z bloggers' story and the fact that Putin seems to be, as I said earlier on, sharpening the axe for them. What were your reflections on the significance of that, Hamish?
I had a chat with one of my dear friends and contacts who's very, very expert in this area and the Russians and their language and everything about it. And we thought it was pretty significant. We know all about sort of Putin's useful idiots, but the Kremlin's recent turn against some of its most loyal cheerleaders, does seem to be really telling. These increasingly Stalinist purges suggest that the wheels may be coming off the propaganda machine, which is masking Putin's war crimes and trying to justify his war to ordinary Russians. I think the extraordinary and spectacular collapse of Roman Alekhine has sent a shockwave through this online community. As you mentioned earlier, for the last 4 years, they believed that they had tacit license to criticize the way it was being fought. That fantasy has erupted, and Sergei Markov, the once dependable pro-Kremlin voice, has now been branded a foreign agent, a label steeped in Stalinist-era menace, once reserved for genuine enemies of the state, although today it's wielded pretty freely. And as you said, Kara-Murza, commenting on this, suggesting this machinery of repression starts, and they can't really stop it. And in Soviet Union under Stalin, first they went for their political enemies, and then the system began to devour its own people. It serves as a stark reminder that these authoritarian regimes rarely collapse from external pressure. They rot from within, sort of consuming their very own people who once upheld them. So in sum, I and we, do think this is significant. And you only have to look at X at the moment to see some of the stuff coming out of the Kremlin. I mean, there are an awful lot of American sort of bloggers as well on the very right wing who are shouting the same sort of stuff. But it does seem to be becoming increasingly desperate. And as you and Dom have quite clearly articulated, the situation happening that we are seeing on the front line is very different from the picture being painted by some of these bloggers.
Well, thanks very much, Hamish. Well, we've talked a lot about the First World War today, but you've recently been at one of the iconic locations of the Second here in London, which is, of course, the Cabinet War Rooms where Winston Churchill ran the war effort from. Why were you there? And you're going to talk us through some of the interviews that you did, which listeners will hear later on.
Well, absolutely, yeah. I mean, the Churchill War Rooms, if people haven't been, do absolutely go there. It's a phenomenal setup, and anybody who's seen The Darkest Hour will recognise it. But we were at that location. I was helping organise a conference on the proliferation of chemical weapons and the use of chemical weapons. People will have heard me discuss before, my time in Syria, where President Assad used chemical weapons to great extent and pretty much kept himself in power until November 2024, when he fell. One of the doctors, another doctor that I was heavily involved in Syria, a chap called Abdul Karim, who was a neurosurgeon, then was forced out of Syria initially in the sort of 2014, came to the UK, did a PhD at King's College London, and then he and I and others were running medical networks in Idlib province and teaching people how to survive chemical attacks, but I think more importantly, collecting the evidence. So I was helping him in the Idlib Health Directorate, and he was helping us when we were sort of setting up the white helmets and the CBRN task force. So after the fall of Assad, he and his family have returned to Damascus, where he's running the charity Syria Relief, and is also heavily involved in the medical ministry there, and may well become the minister. So he was reiterating a lot of stuff that I'd been saying on the chemical side there. But also, sort of allied to that, we had Sir Andrew Mitchell, who is still an MP, but was shadow foreign secretary and was the DFID minister a number of times. And he was a great cheerleader for those of us who are actually on the ground in Syria during the war, trying to convince the UK government to support the Syrians better. I interviewed him for the pod, And the other person was a chap called Jackie, who was an American Ranger, I think, been in the Ukraine army for the last 4 years and works in the G7 department of 3rd Army Corps based in Kharkiv. And he's been fighting there for the last sort of 2.5 years, I think. He tells us what the chemical attacks have been like in Ukraine, still happening at the moment. It was through him and others that we managed to organise the Ukraine military to get the right respirators, which, people might be surprised to hear Britain is the biggest and best producer of them, get them out to Ukraine. So it was really about the proliferation. It was also about the concern that Russians might step things up, with the Board of Inquiry about to announce from the Salisbury chemical attack and the death of Dawn Sturgis coming up in a few weeks' time. It's all this sort of stuff is going to come to the fore again. Unfortunately, if you have no morals or scruples, you would use chemical weapons all the time because they're morbidly brilliant and rather too easy to use. And we've seen that in Ukraine.
Well, thanks, Hamish. Let's hear those recordings now then. First with Jackie from 3rd Corps and then with Sir Andrew Mitchell.
Jackie, you're just back from the front. What's it like at the front at the moment? What's happening?
For our side, anyway, it's a pretty severe lack of infantry. We've got something like I call it an inverse gray zone, where we have our typical gray zones dividing forces, but additionally lots of small sabotage infiltration groups, which they're not trained guys to do this. Just small groups of Russian infantry are deliberately penetrating the line in order to try to avoid fights, hide, and make disruption. But, these guys don't make it out alive. They were all going to die. They're just these disposable infantry behind our own lines that we'll clean up eventually.
So this is the Russians. We've talked about them throwing people into the meat grinder, untrained guys.
It's the new version of the meat grinder, sort of an evolution of the Storm Z Wagner tactics from Bowman.
And we've been talking today in London a lot about chemical weapons and the chemical attacks in Ukraine, and you and I have been discussing this for many months, if not years. How are the Russians doing these chemical attacks?
So they have some prepared munitions like the K-51 grenade or the RGBO grenade. These are going to carry chloropicrin, but they do other combinations of chloropicrin and phenol or fluoroacetamide, phenol, acrolein. That's the stuff that we've conducted samples on over in Ukraine, and they're sometimes putting additives into the chloropicrin, and very often what the threat may be is this stuff actually sinking down into the trench and displacing oxygen, and that's where, in one case, a guy could have an irritant, or in another case, he could suffocate from lack of O2. And these are not small events. We recorded 5,000 events happening on the front line in the first 6 months of 2025 so far.
You were talking about how sometimes also the lack of oxygen available in the trenches is having a real impact. Can you just sort of describe that to me?
Well, first off, the Russians are going to be dropping the chemical in there as they have an assault group on approach or as they have an FPV drone on approach. And they're going to be trying to get the defenders inside their blindage to come out. The guys know that if they come out, they're going to get killed on the surface, either by an ambush or by an FPV drone. So they may choose to stay inside and deal with the consequences. They may have a gas mask. But even if they wear that thing, they may lose O2 down in that chemical. Everybody has a dugout. Everybody's dug in underground.
That's a really telling thing that a lot of us so-called experts had not really considered. And are the British and American gas masks now reaching the front line?
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly the Avon masks are really great. But there's lots of other manufacturers that soldiers from our army will try to acquire on their own. They may get a Chinese mask or a CM6 or a Mirror Safety or something like that. The shipments from NATO partners, particularly for the Avon masks, have been coming in, filters as well. But we need more, of course. We need more for the guys who are actually doing the fighting. They don't have enough. And we attrit a lot of equipment, Hamish. So I know people celebrate when they send a certain amount of masks or a certain amount of munitions. We're going to shoot the munitions. We're going to carry the masks around. They're going to get blown up. They're going to get lost. They're going to get used. And so we need a lot.
Great. Thank you very much for sparing the time to come over to the UK to educate us. Safe travels and Slava Ukraini.
Heroam Slava. Thank you, Hamish.
Sir Andrew Mitchell, former DFID minister, former shadow foreign secretary. How do you think the war is going in Ukraine at the moment?
Well, I think that every day that Ukraine continues not only to survive, but to hold its own against the Russians is a bad day for Putin. And what we're seeing is an extraordinary series of events, because Putin would never be able to pacify Ukraine, even if he got some form of surrender out of Ukraine. I've been to Ukraine, I've been to Kiev, and I've been to Odessa in the last year, and I've seen that these people are absolutely furious at the way their country has been attacked by the Russians, their infrastructure bombed, their citizens murdered. So I think it's going as well as it could be at the moment, but it's very important that we give the strongest possible support to Zelensky and Ukraine.
Talking about that support, are we doing enough?
Well, we can always do more, and we should do more in two ways. First of all, we should make sure they've got the weapons that their military commanders believe they need. But also, we need to use Britain's convening power to corral other countries into supporting this effort. Because if we fail and Putin wins, don't believe for a moment that he will stop there. The Baltics will be in his sights next. Europe has got war once again for the first time since the Second World War, and we need to make sure that Putin doesn't win this.
Really, on the back of that, do you see any chance at all that Putin will come to the peace negotiation table, or any chance for peace in the near future?
Well, I think he has been playing with President Trump, and I don't think he's had any intention whatsoever of agreeing a deal at this point. But the longer the war goes on, the more we bear down on Russia's economy, the more we show our determination to support Ukraine in fighting off this illegal and horrific war that Putin has launched, then the more chance there is that Putin will decide to set out on a plan for peace. I don't think that's the position at the moment, and that's why we must support Ukraine with everything we've got.
Great. So, Andrew, thank you very much indeed for that.
Well, let's turn to our final thoughts now. Dom's had to dash off for yet another interview with a bigwig, this time in the Foreign Office here. We'll obviously play that very soon on the podcast. But Verity, as our guest here at the Telegraph today, where would you like to leave listeners?
After talking through both of those soldiers, what I am very struck by is that they both paint a very similar picture of the situation when it comes to medical evacuations. And I think, the second tale, it might sound quite thrilling and dramatic, but at the heart of this was a man who spent 33 days with a tourniquet around him. It's completely unimaginable. From now on, I will really be focusing in on the situation when it comes to medical evacuations, and I will be doing more reporting on that soon.
Thank you, Verity. Hamish, over to you.
I won't indulge myself, but announcing that my book on tanks is going to be published in June next year. That's for another podcast. But what I would say, we've been talking about the bloggers and the propaganda and disinformation. The only thing I'd say, and I might be repeating myself, so I apologise, that I'm going to be doing a Q&A on the Telegraph website, opinion website, between 3 and 4 today. So we've already had over 600 comments, but do comment and get stuck in there. And I'm delighted that actually most people seem to be pro. We get quite a lot of our fans in Moscow commenting, but this time they don't seem to be delighted if people can join me there to have a deeper discussion. Over.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom, Nicholls and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow the Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.